Alrighty. Good afternoon and welcome to the Preparing for Disaster webinar. My name is T. Turner and I am the Farm Services Director here at RAFI, and I'm very glad to have you here today. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that this is an event supported through the United States Department of Agriculture, also known as USDA Transition to Organic Partnership Program, also known as TOP. TOP is a program of USDA's Organic Transition Initiative and is administered by USDA Agricultural Market Services National Organic Program. And also many thanks to our partners at Florida Organic Growers who also supported and collaborated with us on hosting this webinar. We can go to the next slide. Okay. So again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Here's a quick introduction of today's speakers. Representing RAFI, we have Jamie McGirt. Jamie provides one-on-one conservation technical assistance to farmers in the Southeast region of the United States and trains technical assistance providers who support small-scale and diversified farms. She assists farmers in identifying farm business and land stewardship priorities, creating action plans, and identifying resources, partnerships, and referrals that help them advance their market and farm conservation goals. Next, we'll have Elaine Rogers, who works with the North Carolina State Extension Office as an area specialized agent in agriculture with a particular focus on food safety. Elaine provides educational programs, training, and technical support focused on fresh produce safety to agents and growers in Western North Carolina. And finally, we'll have Beth Rotha, who works with Quality Certification Services as the Organic Program Director. Beth is the technical lead for QCS certification teams in the United States and Latin America. Beth's expertise includes policy, compliance, and accreditation across multiple organic standards in all scopes of production and handling. And now that we know who our team of presenters are, I'm going to hand it off to our Just Foods Director, Kelly Dell, for a review of our agenda, a little bit of background of RAFI, and some housekeeping reminders. Kelly?
Can you go to the next slide, Jamie? Okay, on our agenda today, we will be talking about preparing for a farm disaster, farm safety precautions post-disaster, and preserving organic integrity post-disaster. And then we'll have a question and answer session. And a little background on RAFI. RAFI is a 35-year-old nonprofit based in North Carolina, whose mission is to challenge the root causes of unjust food systems by supporting and advocating for economically, racially, and ecologically just farms communities. RAFI has worked to find solutions to decrease the inequities in our food system in an effort to help empower rural communities and decrease the exploitation of those communities by corporate power structures. And a little Zoom housekeeping, everyone is on mute and will have the opportunity to unmute during the question and answer portion of the webinar. And this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with the attendees. And you can place your questions in the Q&A box during the webinar and we will answer them after the presentation. And now I will pass it to Jamie.
Thanks, Kelly. So when we are talking about preparing for a disaster, we are approaching it with what to do before the disaster and also after a disaster on the farm occurs. We strongly believe that if we know what to do before the fact, we are going to be more prepared from the beginning and before a disaster strikes. Next slide. Thank you. So I first want to begin by just acknowledging that we are almost at the 1-year mark of Hurricane Helene that caused catastrophic damage in southeastern states like North Carolina, parts of Tennessee, South Carolina, and Georgia. And in this event, we had unexpected and unprecedented flooding, especially in our mountain communities. And I just want everyone to take care of themselves today. You may see some images that are a reminder of these events if you were a survivor, and please take care of yourself. One thing I also want you to keep in mind throughout today is that there are a lot of different types of farm disasters. We're going to talk about some of those types of disasters, the frequency, the types of locations they occur, but also a disaster can have a drastically different effect on different production types and different types of farms, and depending on the location of those farms. So we're going to talk about some of these nuances and how that determines your preparedness. So we'll begin by differentiating between one-time disaster events and disasters that occur over time. The one-time disaster events are sometimes forecasted by weather predictors, including things like hurricane, floods, wildfire, hailstorms, but also some of the more unpredictable storms. Sometimes we might have intense thunderstorms forecasted, but don't know that we're going to have hail as an effect. The frequency of Dracos in the Midwest and sometimes in North Carolina and southeastern states can wreak havoc in very hyper-specific locations. And then some storms have very little warning, like tornadoes. But we also can't forget about those other one-time disaster events that aren't storm related, such as biohazard or chemical events, such as spills in our communities or on our individual farms. We can also include volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, depending on your location. The disasters over time, however, are the ones that are happening kind of in that slow burn. Those are the disasters that we have a combination of effects happening that lead to the consequence. So a drought might be the consequence of little rainfall and high temperature conditions. Excessive rainfall could be over an entire season or a month or a week's time. Plant diseases and infestations don't often happen immediately. There are precursor events that are leading to those high intensity events. And then excessive snowfall that can occur one time, but it can also occur over time, creating this mass accumulation of material that is impeding you on your farm. I want to highlight the USDA disaster assistance tool, which is linked and will be provided afterwards in a group of resources. This is a great tool to play around with before a disaster, see how it works, but also after a disaster, it helps you kind of categorize the type of event, the location of the event, and what types of financial assistance programs you might qualify for from the federal level. Thanks. I can't advance the slides. Appreciate that, T. For the federal assistance, there are 4 pillar programs that I want to highlight. The non-insured crop disaster assistance program is open for food, fiber, and forage producers that have a loss due to the disaster or weather occurrence. Not all producers are aware that if you are small scale and historically underserved, that you can automatically qualify for NAP insurance as long as you select this option on a federal form offered by the Farm Service Agency. If you have any questions about that form or how to qualify, you're welcome to reach out to us after the presentation. Then there is ELAP, the Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, Farm-Raised Fish. I especially want to highlight, we don't think about honeybees and fish as livestock, but they are considered as livestock by USDA in disaster events. Then there's the Livestock Indemnity Program. So this is the death and loss of livestock due to the disaster or disease prevalence. And lastly, and what is more of my specialization, is the Emergency Conservation Program. Very little known, but covers a wide range of impacts after a disaster, and we'll cover that in a little more detail soon. So what I want you to keep in mind when you're considering, can I qualify for federal assistance after a disaster, is that it's going to depend on the disaster severity. That's going to determine what programs are activated by the United States Department of Agriculture and if you are going to be eligible. It might depend on a disaster declaration or a called state of emergency. The location of the disaster affecting farms matters, and the number of farms affected by the disaster matters. And also, federal relief programs are not immediate. Some take years after the disaster to even be activated or become available. States may also offer assistance after a disaster event as well, so keep that in mind. And what you'll hear throughout today is that documentation is critical. While sometimes there are waivers granted to make sure that you can access these programs, having documentation is going to make the entire process smoother, and at the end of the day, keep your foot in the door. So we'll start with general safety preparedness before a disaster. I recommend that you check out the ready.gov emergency personal household safety list and kit. There's an example of items that you may want to have on hand to prepare for a disaster. It was only after the recent tropical storm in my own community did I put together this emergency kit, because it became relevant for my household very quickly. I also have linked the farm emergency plan template from North Carolina Department of Agriculture. Even if you're not in North Carolina, this is an excellent and comprehensive tool that you can walk through with your farm family. And then specifically livestock preparedness information from the American Veterinary Medical Association. NC State also has a wealth of information about livestock emergency preparedness and precautions. But they also have this resource linked, and it's very thorough. So for farm preparedness, we're going to talk about early preparedness strategies, and we're going to talk about right before the disaster is anticipated. Some of the earliest actions you take can be creating this farm emergency plan. You can take before photos of the farm regularly, and I suggest from the same angle. So always take pictures from this spot on your farm to show the development of the farm over time and the assets you have. Ask yourself, can electrified systems be operated manually in case of a power outage? Review your insurance coverage and which structures are not covered. And make sure that you don't have a policy that is just covering depreciation of your assets, but the structures themselves. Review how to file an insurance claim in the event of a loss or damage. Know how to turn off your power supply and have the tools available to do that. Consider if you need a generator or where you would take cold storage products like meat or produce in case of a power outage. And have your paper and digital copies of contracts, your financial documents, livestock records on file and in multiple locations. That's on paper and digital and backed up in another digital place like a hard drive. And then just before a predicted disaster, we recommend you fuel up your vehicles and generators, have extra fuel, chainsaw oil, chains on site, even charge up your extra drill batteries, because whatever you board up or secure, you may need to quickly access and you don't have a power source. Secure your structures, which we'll talk about some of those briefly. Seal and reinforce windows and doorways. Have an evacuation plan with your family, and also open the communication with neighbors. Understand what their plans are, who you can rely on in the event of a disaster and who you cannot. Know the location of emergency shelters and particularly emergency farm supply distribution sites. This came up time and time again after Hurricane Helene. And if possible, for certain structures on your farm, turn off the power supply right before the storm hits. And some of those additional suggestions include like pacing yourself. Know that if a disaster strikes, your recovery is going to take time. It's okay to ask for help from professionals, from neighbors, from people you trust. And ultimately, you can manage for resilience. And there are a wealth of resources coming out, especially after Helene, about managing your farms for more resilience to frequent and impactful storms. So I have some information that I found really excellent from Atlas Greenhouse about tunnel and greenhouse preparation before a high wind event or storm. This would also relate to potential flooding events. We're not going to go through this in detail. They'll be provided, but there are 2 slides specifically geared to this because of the frequency of tunnels and greenhouses on southeastern farms. So a disaster strikes. What do we do next? First, we always recommend to ensure your personal and your family's safety. This comes first and foremost. While it may feel like you've lost everything or something significant on the farm, your personal well-being can't be replaced. So start there. Even though it feels like what is lost might not be able to be replaced, it may in fact over time. What we start with after safety is documentation. We ask you to document all damages and losses. And remember this phrase, cameras before chainsaws. After you've documented, taking as many pictures as you can, beginning to write notes, you contact your local farm service agency, FSA office, to report the damage. Then you'll need FSA's authorization to clean up damages and losses and make repairs if you want to qualify for financial assistance down the road. And after you begin to make repairs and clean up, you should be documenting and keeping records of all the actions you take on the farm. So we're going to go through each of these steps in a little bit more detail. You take pictures of your damages and losses, and you write detailed notes describing each damage and loss. You might want to note the area of the farm where there's damage and losses, or each individual area where you observe that effect. And note the items and components of each area that has damages and losses. So for example, in a crop field, there might be an effect to the crops planted. There might be an effect to your topsoil quality and quantity. There might be an effect to your irrigation structures and your fencing. So you want to document what happened to each of those items in each area and the extent of it, and then the value of each item damaged or lost. If possible, try to get a third-party witness. That means like a neighbor, a friend, another family member off-site to write down the damage they see and the losses, and to take any photos they can. And lastly, if you do start to make any repairs or cleanup initiative, save your receipts. Okay, so you're documenting and you contact FSA. If you don't know how to contact your farm service agency or FSA office, you can use this tool to look it up. And there's 4 important things you want to tell FSA when you call. And if they don't answer, you can leave a message stating these 4 things. You want to state your farm location, what kind of disaster affected the farm, such as there was a hailstorm, what repairs and cleanup you need to do immediately, and any urgency you need to make those repairs and cleanup. If they are speaking to you on the phone, they're likely going to give you authorization to proceed with those immediate cleanup and repairs. Only in emergency situations should you proceed to do those cleanup and repairs without their authorization. So what it means to get authorized. Like I said, unless it's an emergency, please try to avoid making permanent repairs or field restoration until you're authorized to begin by FSA. You may do the emergency repairs like safety hazards. So that might be like a tree on a roof or a power line. You might have destroyed gates or fencing that are meant to retain livestock, and it's now a livestock or human safety risk for them to be uncontained. Those are the kind of things you can do without authorization. And of course, I'm not saying that you can't proceed with all repairs and cleanup. If you want to have financial assistance further down the line to reclaim some of the financial loss you've experienced, that is why you would need to wait for the authorization from Farm Service Agency. And so now as you're cleaning up and you're making repairs, you want to keep those very detailed records. We recommend that you are recording the time you independently spend or your spouse or other farm partner spends. You want to document volunteer labor because their labor actually has a value to it, and paid laborers' time spent. You want to record the actions done, the machine time used for cleanup and repair, and also the equipment rental cost or fuel cost. So in summary, to qualify for that financial relief, you need to document the impact. You need to contact Farm Service Agency, get Farm Service Agency's authorization, and then continue to keep very detailed records. So what are the types of losses and damages that happen during disasters? This is kind of a view of all of the different categories of losses and damages. You may have it to living creatures on the farm, crops for human or animal consumption, orchard or tree crops usually experience kind of unique damages and losses on the farm. You might experience a loss of the harvested or your stored crops in cold storage or in silo conditions. You might have all kinds of debris deposited on your farm. This could be trash, rock, sand, vegetative, including entire trees. And then your field conditions and topsoil might be significantly altered. If it was a burn event versus a flooding event, you're going to have significant changes in your landscape. You might experience a loss of infrastructure like fencing, water systems, entire buildings, or loss of feed and spoilage of feed stored. You may also have applied conservation improvements on your farm. If there's damage to dams, ponds, vegetative structures that are slowing down erosion, that's considered a damage or a loss. If you had a high tunnel that you put up through NRCS with financial assistance, that is a conservation structure that is lost or damaged in a storm. And then lastly, equipment. This could range from wells to a tractor. One thing that we want to offer folks today is a damage and loss template. I don't expect anyone to remember this when you're affected by a disaster. So know that this resource is always available from RAFI, but I'm going to walk you through using it because we do find it's very practical when a disaster has hit and you need a place to centralize your documentation. So on the far left side, I have the area of the farm where damage occurs. So remember to think about like packaging up the parts of your farm. You might have cropland, pasture land. You might have intense high tunnel production cropland. You may have food storage areas. So think about them in categories and then start to break it down. What are the items in those areas that are damaged or lost, and start to get specific. What's the type of damage or loss? Was it flooded versus rain that started to pool in the environment? And what RAFI can do, and what you can even do yourself once you have these damages and losses itemized, is begin to determine what program can assist you financially with what type of loss or damage. And that's when it begins to get a lot more complicated, and we highly recommend you seeking out technical assistance to navigate that process. And should you need our assistance, our contact information is provided. T, Kelly, and I are members of your disaster assistance team, should you need it. We also have a toll-free hotline, open Monday to Friday, and we have an online disaster hub where we try to keep our materials updated. Thanks. And I'll turn it over to Elena.
Sorry, I realized I was muted. Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I guess I'm so following with the theme now. I'm going to focus on produce, on fresh fruits and vegetables, and talk a little bit about we're not going to spend much. I think it's like the next 15 minutes. We're going to go over the very basics of what are the things to keep in mind when you grow fresh fruits and vegetables. What does like flooding do to this? What does excessive rainfall, what can they do? How can they impact your operations? and walk you through what are some things to keep in mind, okay? The process that we follow basically after Hurricane Helene in helping farms. And so hopefully that, again, I also don't expect you to walk out of this being, an expert, but just to know that there is a process and that we can help you. I am one of two area specialized agents with NC State University. I should have started there. And basically my job is to help like the agents, the farms, the farmers, and direct work through food safety problems. We conduct a lot of training. We do a lot of workshops. So just I'll share my contact information on our website at the end, but just know we're basically here to help you and serve you, and that's what we did after the hurricane. So without further ado, let's go to my slides, okay? And just very briefly, okay? So Hurricane Helene, who would have ever thought, right, that all that we went through happened, and this is one of our farmers in Henderson County, Thousand Roads, beautiful farm, grows a variety of berries. And he called the day before and said, hey, what do I need to be thinking about? What is this going to look like? How is this going to impact my farm? Well, the next day he basically had no crops, okay, in the ground. Most of his farm was heavily flooded and destroyed. So let's go to the next slide. So this is the common scenario. And then on the other hand, and things to think about, not directly with produce, but the fact that we had loss of infrastructure, loss of, a lot of trash come in. What does that do to your farm from a food safety standpoint? The ability to get product in and out, huge. Another big problem we had. Go to the next one. And then, and from a food safety standpoint, we are always worried about, we recognize that, our environment is a great place. I mean, whether you're growing in outdoors, whether you're growing in greenhouses or hoop houses, we can, through implementing good agricultural practices, we can have pretty safe food, pretty safe fresh produce. But when water moves into a field, when your fields are flooded, things happen. And this is where contamination events can really happen and impact the quality and the safety of the produce. Let's go to the so what we're gonna do is, and this is just the last slide with pictures, but just to show you, I mean, so, fields that were completely destroyed, other fields that didn't look as damaged, right? A few weeks later, they looked like they were okay, but there was a significant risk there because of the flooding. And then just to kind of relate to how many things move, the water moved fish, the water moved chemicals, the water moved so many things. So this is why these events are so, so we have to pay attention to them, and we get concerned about them. So let's move on to the science to look a little bit about how do we navigate through this. So basically, the FDA has put out guidance. It's a document, and here's like if you go through the QR code, you will receive a copy of these slides. So don't necessarily worry about going through it. But the guidance from FDA gives us some very general parameters and gives us some very specific, sort of like general parameters for what to do under different situations. So that document is available. And then what we have done at NC State, our NC Fresh Produce Safety website, is that we have kind of taken that information and kind of just provide you with the basics, but then also provide you with our contact information, because we recognize that this might not be, super easy to navigate through, that you need help. So the message here is, if you need help, if there is excessive rainfall, it doesn't have to be a hurricane. If you have questions, please reach out. We'll be glad to help you. This is not something you want to do on your own. Next slide. So the one thing that, as we set foundations and move forward, is that not all water, not all rain events are the same. If we have like heavy rainfall, let's say we had those, right? This past summer, we had those 5 and 7 and 10 inch rains. So if you get a lot of rain and water pools in your field, that is not considered flooding, okay? As long as the water didn't come from from like a creek or a river. If a creek or a river run, that's a different story. But if it's just strictly rainfall that accumulates in your field or soil saturated, that water will go away. And that normally does not create microbial risk, it doesn't create risk, okay? But let's go to the next slide. If we go to if a water, like if flood waters, okay, and this flood waters meaning water that is outside of your control as a farmer, Water that's coming from a river, from a lake, from a creek, from a stream overflows and runs into your fields. Now we do have a problem. That water we are really concerned about. Why are we concerned about it? Because it can bring with it can bring bad bacteria, or you can bring pathogens, it can bring chemicals, it can bring other contaminants that now impact your farm. And the reality is, and I added this here in this slide, is that if something has been flooded, there is no practical method. There is no way to wash that produce and recondition it and make it safe. Once it has been flooded, we have the FDA considers that that produce is now adulterated, meaning it cannot be sold for human consumption. So that is something else. Here is a table, again, just with a very basic kind of like, what does the FDA document say? So the FDA document says that if the produce is considered adulterated because it came in contact with floodwaters, it cannot be sold for, again, it cannot be put in commerce. If the FDA also provides recommendations for what if my field flooded, but the floodwaters did not touch the produce or came close to the produce. That can also be a problem. So they recommend that you assess assess the situation, look at everything, try to figure out, what the plan is, what risks have been introduced, and how can we manage them. So that is the second type of scenario that we did have. And then the third one is where a field has been flooded, okay? And now like you pretty much saw probably Dalton's field, okay? So now that field has to be worked and like you have to replant it. So they also provide guidelines for what is the wait period? Why do we wait? Well, what's the wait period and what to, consider before replanting a field. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to show you these in a little more sort of like maybe bring them to life. And so just a couple things, is like if we have an area that's flooded, you want to always try to stay away from that flooded area. Let the soil completely dry, figure out what's happened so that you don't move any of that possible contamination more into your field. One of the challenges that we have when we have a field, for example, if we grow tomatoes or any crops that grow up, is that they might have not touched floodwaters might have not come in contact with the tomatoes or the fruit itself. But the problem is that it is really hard to keep those harvest containers free of contamination as you're walking through the fields. Think of all the movement of workers or harvesters. So those are all things that we want to consider. So these resources, we'll be sharing these resources from this really nice posters that California LGMA has put together. And then the other thing is that we want to set buffers, and there is nothing in, technically this is a recommendation, like that you would want to have a 30-foot buffer between the flooded areas and the rest of your field. So that is something that really very site specific. Some farms we could do that, other farms not, but at least as much as possible, we want to prevent from going into those areas. And then the other thing, which we will talk more in detail in the next few slides, is like checking your water sources. I will get to that. Let's go to the next slide. But just briefly, um, when these things happen, what we're looking at what is happening around a farm. We're looking, does your neighbor, you may not have cows or livestock or poultry, but does your neighbor have cows? Did the water, where did the water go through? Is there any industrial site? Are there any industrial sites? Is there any chemical storage around that could have been, added to the waters? All these things, these are the kinds of things we're looking as we're doing this flood assessments and trying to help you find answers. Okay, next slide. Uh, so for Helene, and this probably would be what we would do for most situations, is that we did have to set priorities. And the priorities were to help first the farms that had produce that didn't get flooded, but where flooding occurred in the area, so that we could figure out if it was safe for them to harvest that produce or not. Okay, and how were they going to do that? What were the logistics? The other thing was for farms that were flooded, to assess soil and water sources to determine, what had happened and then what was the remediation going to look like. And the third one was for farms that were heavily, heavily damaged, where basically they lost infrastructure, they lost everything, helping them kind of come up with a better plan for, hey, now that we have a blank slate, what can we do and what is that wait period going to look like? So the one thing, if there was maybe one thing that was like positive about Helene, is that this happened in the fall when most farms are slowing down. We still have a significant number of small farms that are, growing a lot of greens, they're growing a lot of different crops, but at least like most of the larger commercial production was out of the way. And so it kind of bought us a little time. Let's move on to the next slide. So these are all resources from California LGMA. I do want to say, especially with a storm like Helene, where we lost communication and all that, it was really hard, right? And even as we were visiting growers, but California LGMA has come up with 3 videos. They are 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes long. They are available in English and Spanish, and they walk you through the basics of what is flooding, what to do after a flooding, and what types of flooding are there. Okay, so these are videos, and there are really nice posters that go with them. And there is all this is available. We've made it here's the link to get to that. And then the other thing is very specific guidelines for planting after a flood event. There's a video about that, and I'll show you in a little bit. That's maybe the more complicated side of all this. So the first and foremost is it's important to do a flood assessment tool. In this case, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so we just used the form that California LGMA had. Very simple to fill out, but it kind of helped us set priorities, and it helped us kind of assess where every field was and how to, what should we do, what our action plan should be. Next slide. So the other part, as I wrap up, not getting into much more detail, but is the part that really concerns us. Okay, I would say that where your soil, yes, we have to be aware of, and we were looking for issues with soil, but where we feel in food safety that we really have to be careful, it has to be with water. So water is great for irrigating crops. Water is great for washing your produce when you harvest it, for hand washing. But water also carries pathogens. And an event like Helene was like pretty catastrophic from a right? Because now we had water in places where you normally don't have water, or water systems and water irrigation that got completely destroyed. So agricultural, when you see that term there, agricultural water system, I'm not just referring to the irrigation infrastructure. I'm referring from everything from the pump, the intakes, to if you're pumping water from a creek, or your well. We're looking at everything, all the components that have to do with that infrastructure. I'm trying to assess if they're safe or not. So the next few slides, I'm just going to basically focus on water sources and just show you some things that are really important to note. So we did have in the Asheville area in Buncombe County, we had an extended boiling water notice, right? Y'all probably remember, for those of you that are in that area. And just want a word of caution. So when you have a boiling water notice, that means that the system is compromised, right? That when they're doing those tests, there are issues. So they issue very specific recommendations, and most of the recommendations were for the house, for households, like, you can do this, but you can't do that. Like, do not use water for X, Y, Z. But what that means in the produce world is it means that if you have a boiling water notice, you cannot use that water to wash produce after harvest. None of that water can touch produce that has been harvested. You cannot wash your hands with that water. You need to find an alternate source, and you cannot use that water to clean and sanitize food contact surfaces. So like bins, harvest bins, any of that, you cannot. And so the option for this water is to treat it. And during Hurricane Helene, we were kind of at the tail end of the season, and it was really hard to find water treatment options at the farm level. Okay, at the farm, there are many other ways we can treat water, but one practical way is with chemicals. And there is a line of products called Sanidate, and Sanidate 15 is the only product that has a label to reduce microorganisms of public health concern. And so that product was not really readily available. We could have used it and really benefit from it, but it was not available. So that is something that we hope that in the future we can have more of around. Okay, let's move on. The next one was wells. I just want to say, if for those farms that had wells, this is a well that was submerged for like over a week after the hurricane. So the problem with that is that, yes, we did, even at NC State, everyone issued recommendations about inspecting, purging, and disinfecting your wells. But from a food safety standpoint, we know that this well, even though you might do all these things and you come in and pull a test and the sample comes back good, it might be you're now actually open yourself up for, like, there's fractures, there's damage to that well. It could be that there's damage to the well casing. So we have seen persistent contamination over time. And the problem with that is that, so on the year after Helene, for farms that had these problems, we recommended testing more than once to make sure that water quality was not compromised, again because of the extended period. Next slide. And then the last one is about water, surface water. So very briefly, just want to say this is the area where personally we were more concerned, because we did have, thank goodness, a lot of our industry, the apple industry, for example, was still harvesting and they were still in season, okay? And they did not get flooded. Most farms did not get flooded. So they wanted to operate, but here their main water source for some of these farms might be ponds or creeks. So we did discourage, okay, all farms. If you have had flooding, or if like your pond or your got flooded, or like at that point in time, we really discourage anyone from using surface water, because at that point in time, we were no longer just worried about bad bacteria, pathogens getting in the water. We were worried about chemicals. We were worried about other contaminants. So next slide. And just to also be clear, there is no practical way to treat that water to address all those concerns, okay? So we did discourage this until the water could be assessed, so it could be tested, and we could take corrective actions. And the reality is that after a week, or I would say not a week, but maybe it took a month, but the water quality actually started coming back to, where it was, we felt okay about using water in some of these places. There was a lot of ponds that had to be redug and worked on, because they got, basically a lot of damage. But this is a complicated portion of like flooding water system. So okay, so to kind of wrap this up, here are the resources, like the FDA, the guidance document from FDA, the guidance document from California LGMA. The reason we use them, you might wonder, why are we using resources, is because the last 2 years, the Salinas Valley and the areas where a lot of produce is grown, they have had significant flooding. So they have actually paid for a lot of research. They're a bigger industry and they could afford to do that. And that's how they came up with this really good resources. So I mean, even though they are so far away from us, they were so supportive and helped us so much. And we were super happy that we could actually text a lot of these videos to growers and text the infographics, and that kind of helped growers, ease some of the concerns. And then Western growers also have other things. As I wrap up this presentation, I think when T asked me to speak, she actually asked me about how can we protect the farm, right? But I thought there's no way we can talk about real protection if we haven't talked about the issues. So that's why I took you through sort of like how do we think about flooding in the food safety world. But long story short, as we get into this, I put this slide together, and when I put it together, I really thought about, my goodness, the maybe, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 farms that we visited right after the hurricane. And then I had worked in North Florida before, so I'm very familiar with hurricane damage, right, and with flood damage. And I will have to say, if there's a common denominator, is that the farms that fare better, if they were close to water sources, it was the farms that did much, much better was the farms that have vegetative buffers, whether it's grass, shrubs, a variety, but you need a green area. If you're farming all the way to the river or to a creek, when bad flooding happens, it's going to destroy your farm and it's going to be much, much harder. Just in Mills River, we have the research station. We have a research station from on one side of the river where we have been terrible stewards of not having, probably in that area, we should be using conservation tillage. Well, the other side of the river is basically is a grass buffer. And there is like some beautiful gardens there, actually vegetable gardens. And the difference was night and day. That was like maybe the best area where we could compare the damage. Again, the river in the same area destroyed one side versus like the other side got flooding, but it was not as destroyed. The other thing is consider flood lines. And I know this, the people asking, well, what do I do? Like Helene was a 1 in 100 year flood, okay? But do think about years when it has flooded. And I want you to think about that, because if you think about the last 15 or 20 years, if you've been there that long, what are the times when flooding occurred? And so for those areas where it floods, I would strongly recommend not planting crops that are in those areas that grow close to the ground. Do not plant greens there. Do not plant underground, crops that grow underground. Those areas are more prone to flooding. And even if it doesn't flood, but if excessive rainfall happens, that can compromise, that can move pathogens in the area. The other thing is think about bins, think about where you store when you're building buildings in your farm. And I know, again, this kind of sounds like common sense, but it's not. Think about what are those areas? How can I make sure that those areas where I store bins, where I store containers, where I store farm equipment are away from those flood zones? That is really, really important. We've seen a lot of issues with that. And then I also wanted to mention, let me see, after a flood, ask for assistance. There is one, and I don't know if I have this bullet point in the next slide or not, but it has to do with livestock. Let me see. No, like go back to that, to T, go back. Yeah, sorry, I didn't put it here. But the one really important thing is if you operate a diversified farm, if you have livestock, if you have poultry, think about where they're at, because think about how you're going to lay the pastures, how you're going to have your areas where your poultry, if you have free range poultry, where are they going to go in relation to your produce? Because we had farms that obviously when the flood came, when you have excessive rainfall, you have to move your animals up. But the problem is that then you have your crops grow, you don't have, there's no, the farm was not laid out correctly. So now that can be a contamination event in itself, that you have livestock moving very close to where produce is being grown. So I will say those are the things you've got to think about ahead of time, and then recognize that even though you may have really good fences for livestock, when we have flooding, all that manure that's in the surface is now going to become like, when flood waters come in, it becomes like a giant compost tea, and it's a compost tea that is like unsafe, right? Because it now has all these pathogens in it. So do consider, how can I lay out, if I have livestock or poultry, how can I lay out my farm? How can I where do I, how do I design those paddocks? How do I design those fields so that hopefully you can still obviously protect your animals, but also protect the safety of your produce that you're growing. And then the other thing is, if you need help again, which is like damage from a food safety standpoint, realize that for insurance purposes, you cannot sell flooded produce. So it is important to document all that so that you can, eventually that's part of your claim, even when produce may look like it was fine. But if it is too close to flood waters, it might be that it's impossible to get to that produce and harvest it safely. The other thing is like mitigation practices. I didn't really get into soil testing here, but we did do extensive soil testing. And I have to report that at least on the farms that we tested, we did not find, I mean, I think like we looked for heavy metals. We looked for, there was 8 heavy metals. This was we were testing for these as a result of a larger survey that the soils department at NC State did, where they went to many, many sites and they looked for contaminants. And other than, I want to say we didn't really find anything other than, I believe there was a few farms where elevated cadmium levels were there. And then we recognized that actually the cadmium levels were elevated before the storm ever came. So that was just elevated levels on those. So that would, really help us. But and then the last thing is, if you need help with implementing a cleaning and sanitation program or a disinfection program after an event, please let us know. Those are areas that we worked in, and looking at your water quality. for those of you that, if you want to come to one of our trainings, we do have an upcoming training, a Produce Safety Alliance training in Wilkesboro on November 13th. And this is about the federal rule and how basically learning food safety 101 from a produce standpoint. So from that, this is our website, NC Fresh Produce Safety. You can just Google that and you'll find a lineup of our events and workshops and all the content that we manage. So, and this is my contact information. And, again, just if you need help, this is something you don't want to tackle by yourself, please reach out to your county agent, or, one of these, of the team here at RAFI, and they will help you, because this can be complicated. But at the same time, if everything's okay, we want to help you. We want to move on and help you, keep doing a great job. So.
Elaine, you had a few more slides. Did you want to do those, or are you okay to?
No, I think I did have some from soil testing, but it just depends if there's time or not. Like,
You can go through the soul.
okay. So just very briefly, I do want to show you that this is something so we didn't do soil testing in all the farms we visited. Part of the reason is that it's very expensive, and this is a methodology that was developed like maybe 2-3 years ago as a result of the flooding in California. But for the farms that we did do soil testing, it was a very, very intense process. We did take about 20 samples from the areas that were flooded, and we submitted them to a commercial lab, and we had them tested for STEC, E. coli 0157, Salmonella, and generic E. coli. And that information kind of gave us, like, it helped us kind of like support the notion of, well, hey, do we wait? This farm maybe needs to wait longer than 30 days or 60 days before they replant, or this farm is okay, if they wanted to get greens back in the ground pretty quickly. But this was a soil test, so this is a protocol, and we were actually able to get a little bit of grant funding to do this. I would not expect, I mean, the cost for just the testing is about $1,200. So it's something that we would want to find the help to help you with. Okay, we would not. This is a pretty, and the samples have to be shipped overnight, so it's a very intense process. Let's go to the next slide, and I can just show you. So we were originally concerned, right? Like the storm. These are all my pictures, so this is stuff all that I saw, right? Like so many, tanks with fuel, with oil and all that. So we were really paying attention to what those water testing were telling us, and we were worried about chemical and physical contaminants. I have to say that out of all the groups that I work with, and that we've reviewed the data, we find, thank goodness, that other than, I want to say, hydrocarbons, so like fuels, that was one thing that was found in the waters. There was nothing made, thank goodness. Maybe, it rained so much. We attribute it to the dilution factor, that we had such a large volume of water that moved through. But that was a big concern that we had, and we were, we feel pretty good about it. Let's go to I think it's the last slide. And I just want to show you, so one thing that does happen, especially in severe flooding events, and this picture really is probably the best picture I have for this. So one thing that happened is the storm came, and then if y'all remember, it didn't rain for 30 days at all, right? But so the soils, basically all this silt that moved into the fields, it just crusted. It became like this very thick crust, and it was dry. But once you started digging the soil, this is a picture taken like 35 days after the storm. All the soil underneath was wet, and it was like trapped. All that moisture was trapped. So for the areas where we believe that there could have been any kind of, where the factors were there, for example, there was livestock nearby, where we felt there could be contamination, we went ahead and did soil testing. And we basically followed the North Carolina State University Soil Strike Team recommendations. This last slide here will show you what we tested for. So these are the heavy metals. This is the primary and secondary heavy metals. So we did testing for all these in addition to the 20 samples that we submitted for microbial. And so we feel pretty good, because the farms that we tested, again, other than one farm that had barely elevated cadmium, we didn't find anything. So this is not, we did not do, I would say, enough testing to speak for the whole area, but at least in the produce growing areas, this is what we saw. Okay, and just last but not least, so the one part I wanted as a disclaimer is that soil testing is not a perfect science, and it's really hard to recover pathogens. Pathogens live and they live in the environment, but they die pretty quickly, or they are hard to recover by lab methodologies. So long story short, we submitted samples, but you see this little dog. This is a farm that had a lot of livestock around their production fields. And long story short, out of all those samples we submitted, only one sample came back positive for, I think it was E. coli and 157. But we were able, before even though the test results were important, it was more important to recognize that there was animals and that there was manure in the vicinity. And so we recommended, for example, to that farmer to not harvest that crop, because we felt that, even though flood water was damage was partial, we felt there was a high chance that there had been contamination because we knew the livestock were there. So that's to say that even though we can spend all this money and send samples to the lab, we cannot ignore condition. When we know that there's problems in the field, when you can actually see them, it's better to stay on the safe side, so with that, I just have to say, this is not easy, especially if someone has gone through the traumatic process of like having flooding or damage to their farm. So we are here basically to help you, and we hope to be here, to continue to be here to help you and support you in any way you can. And if you have questions, or if there's any technical service providers, if you need help, please reach out. Okay.
Thank you, Elaine. And now we are going to pass it over to Beth.
Thanks, Elena and Jamie, and to Rafi for having me here today. I am learning so much. I think it's so interesting to hear about natural disasters from all of these different perspectives and these different specialties. And what's really interesting is both where we do overlap, right, and where we don't. There's a lot of different things that we can contribute. So my name is Beth Rhoda, and I'm the Director of Quality and Accreditation at Quality Certification Services. QCS is a nonprofit USDA accredited organic certifier with over 30 years of experience in organic certification. We are also the organic certification arm of the Florida Organic Growers, which is the top lead in the southeast of the US. QCS works with all types and sizes of organic operations throughout the US and in several foreign countries. And today I'll be talking to you about how organic farms can prepare for and make the best efforts to preserve organic integrity in the face of natural disasters and what to do in their aftermath. Next slide. So natural disasters pose numerous risks for organic operations beyond safety and economic concerns, food safety, personal safety, and economic concerns that the other speakers were talking about. And one of the most obvious risks is contamination from prohibited substances that results from floodwaters, spills, high winds. Some types of natural disasters can constrain an operation's ability to meet organic production requirements. For example, flood or drought can make it impossible for a ruminant livestock producer to meet grazing requirements. Disaster might disrupt your ability to access the inputs you need to produce organic crops or livestock, such as approved fertilizers, organic feed, or organic seedlings. Next slide. So we could probably spend a whole day talking about how natural disasters disrupt and challenge organic producers in particular. But today I'm going to focus on 4 topics to help you prepare for natural disasters on organic farms and what to do in their aftermath. These topics are identifying and mitigating risks, requesting a temporary variance to organic requirements in the face of natural disaster, mandated emergency pest or disease treatment, and how to assess and address a natural disaster's impact on your operation's organic integrity. If you're a certified organic farm, your certifier should be your best resource to help you understand the topics and the organic regulations behind them and implement any changes you need to make to your organic system plan now or in the future. So the first step to mitigating risk to organic integrity, be it from natural disaster or any other type of risk, is to identify the risks to your specific operation and the likelihood that the risk will occur. Specifically, I'm talking about risks to organic integrity that could affect your operation's organic status or the organic integrity of the products that you produce. For example, if your farm is in the hurricane-prone Southeast or somewhere that gets heavy rainfall, you should consider how a flood could contaminate your field with conventional fertilizers or pest control products that are applied to upstream farms. If the risk is significant, think about mitigation strategies such as, and I know you've heard this before in today's presentation, vegetated berms around organic fields, riparian buffers along waterways that could hold off floodwaters. Another example of a risk is that a ruminant livestock producer won't be able to provide sufficient feed from pasture due to ever increasing risks of drought and flood events. So ruminant livestock producers need to manage enough pasture to meet organic requirements, not just in years with ideal conditions, but also have plenty of pasture to account for and adapt to variations and extremes in precipitation and temperature. Organic producers should also think about risks of contamination originating from their own operation, hence the picture of a manure pile sitting in a rainy field. So the USDA organic regulations require organic producers to manage plant and animal materials in a way that does not cause contamination of crops, soil, or water by plant nutrients, pathogenic organisms, heavy metals, or residues of prohibited substances. Again, an organic farm can be the source of a contamination, and we want to think about that risk. So consider how natural disasters that are prevalent in your region may lead to contamination if the risks aren't properly addressed. So the organic system plan, it's a template provided by your organic certifier. It most likely covers these types of risks throughout the paperwork, but doesn't have a dedicated section that's just going to point out natural disasters, right? These things are kind of incorporated throughout the organic system plan application. But the next time you review your organic system plan, say to submit an annual update to your certifier, or anytime you're just having a look at it, take a moment to reconsider your practices and procedures with natural disasters in mind. You can review your site-specific risks as well during your annual inspection with your organic inspector. They're on site. You can talk about things while they're on site and get feedback about the mitigation strategies that you have in place. They're really great resources. Okay, I'm going to talk about temporary variances next. In some cases, an organic operation or operations located in a specific region can get a reprieve from some organic requirements for a specific time period. This is known as temporary variance, and there's detailed rules in section 205-290 of the organic regulations. Temporary variances may be established by the USDA administrator when a natural disaster is declared by the US Secretary of Agriculture, or when there's an other verifiable damage that's caused by drought, wind, flood, excessive moisture, hail, tornado, earthquake, or fire. For crop operations, temporary variance may apply to the requirements for soil fertility and crop nutrient management, organic seed and planting stock, crop rotation, pest, weed, and disease management, and wild crop harvesting. Temporary variance may also apply to some requirements for organic livestock operations, such as the origin of livestock, livestock feed, care, living conditions, and pasture practices. The most common temporary variance that gets approved is a reduction of the requirement for dry matter intake from pasture on ruminant livestock operations when a region is hit by extreme drought. Now, a temporary variance will never allow an organic operation to use prohibited substances. So those are like conventional fertilizers, pest control products, or excluded methods like GMOs. If you think your operation might qualify for a temporary variance, contact your certifier first and provide supporting evidence. They'll let you know what they need. And they can submit a temporary variance request to the USDA on your behalf, and they'll notify you of the outcome. Don't make any changes on your farm unless and until the temporary variance gets approved, because you might be out of compliance. Temporary variances do get published on the USDA website. And I realize that the link is not the URL, so it's just a clickable link there that won't work for you. But if you just look up USDA organic temporary variances, you can come to a list of current temporary variances. I think right now there's just one, and it's for drought. All right. Pest and disease outbreaks present another type of disaster that can impact organic integrity. Section 205672 of the USDA organic regulations outline the rules about emergency pest and disease treatment when a mandatory program is authorized by a federal, state, or local agency for the purpose of controlling or eradicating a pest or disease. This can be for crops or it can be for livestock. Such a program may entail mandatory application of substances that are prohibited in organic production directly to organic crops or organic livestock. Now, I'll say that these events are very rare, but if and when they occur, reach out again to your certifier to document the event and how you'll comply with the organic requirements about emergency pest and disease treatments. Crops and livestock that are treated with prohibited substances due to an emergency pest or disease treatment program cannot be sold, labeled, or represented as organic, with these exceptions. Milk and milk products from treated dairy animals can be marketed as organic 12 months after treatment, and offspring from treated breeder stock can be represented as organic only if the treatment was not during the last third of gestation. And as long as the certified operation otherwise meets the requirements of this section of the regulation, an operation's certification status would not be affected as a result of the application of the prohibited substance, meaning they don't have to go back through the transition process. Next slide. So as was mentioned before, after any disaster, safety for yourself, your family, and your livestock should be your #1 priority. Once everyone is safe and you have your needs met, it's important to assess the impacts on your organic farming operation. Contact your certifier. You might need extra time to meet pending deadlines, right? You have a lot of other things to worry about. You might not meet your, certification renewal deadlines. You might have information due to your certifier or have a scheduled inspection that you need to delay. Your certifiers are going to understand. QCS in particular worked with a lot of farmers that were affected by Helene, and then a couple of weeks later by another hurricane in Florida last year. And it's just really important to open that line of communication about if you need additional time, and certifiers should be willing to give you that additional time. You also have to let your certifier know if the impacts of the disaster might affect your ability to implement your organic system plan, right? The way you had planned to operate or comply with organic requirements. For example, we talked a lot about ruminant livestock producers. Maybe you have drought. Maybe you won't be able to meet the 30% dry matter intake from pasture. So you want to work with your certifier to request a temporary variance. Or if a hailstorm destroyed your greenhouse and all of your seedlings that you had planned to plant for this year's crop, right? Organic requirements require that seedlings are all certified organic. Well, maybe you just lost your crop. So you want to talk to your certifier about what to do. Your certifier, again, should be your best resource to help you understand how to move forward and maintain compliance given the disaster's impact on your farm. You'll also want to notify your certifier immediately if you suspect or are concerned about the possibility of contamination from prohibited substances after a natural disaster, right? We were talking earlier about floodwaters coming from moving water upstream, right? If you are downstream of a conventional operation that had conventional fertilizers or conventional pesticides, or if there's some sort of industrial facility upstream, you'll want to talk to your certifier about that, right? All of these things are extra requirements on top of any type of FDA rules about food safety, right? Here I'm just talking about requirements with the USDA organic regulations. So Section 205-400F of the USDA organic regulations requires that operations immediately notify certifiers of any application, including drift, of a prohibited substance to any part of an organic operation. Even if you're not sure if something was, even if it wasn't intentional, right? This is a contamination event. Let's say we're just recently in my town, a tractor trailer with phosphonic acid spilled on the side of the road, right? Something like that happens. It's part of a disaster, and you've got to let your certifier know about it. Your certifier should be equipped to send an inspector out to your farm. They can assess the situation. They can determine the best time to collect samples, do the sample collection, submit all of that to the lab. And in most cases, your certifier is going to cover the costs of doing any laboratory analysis for pesticide residue contaminations. If they do pesticide residue tests, they'll notify you of the results of that pesticide residue test and any follow-up action that would have to be taken if pesticide residues are found. Even if pesticides are caused by something like a natural disaster, the USDA regulations have some specific guidelines about that. And they say that if there's residues detecting prohibited substances, so substances that aren't allowed in organic production at levels that are 5% or more of the EPA's tolerance, then those products can't be sold, labeled, or as or represented as organic. And this clause is there to protect the integrity of USDA organic seal, even when residues are the results of what we call unavoidable residual environmental contamination. And last slide. I'll just say that understanding organic regulations related to natural disasters and the risks associated with your particular operation will help you to implement appropriate mitigation strategies and be prepared if and when disasters occur. So thanks to everyone for participating today, and I'm looking forward to some Q&A.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Elena. You ladies were wonderful, and Jamie as well. We didn't have any questions in the chat, but I do want to just take the time to open it up to the audience if you have any questions that may have come